In 1612, Avraham Portaleone of Mantua published a landmark work of encyclopedic proportions, covering all things Beis Hamikdash. Reading through 4 of his discussions, we meet a man working under far from ideal conditions. His Sefer turns out to be a part of a larger story about the struggles of Jewish printing and Jewish book possession in 16th and 17th century Italy. A Sefer that was printed in Italy by the title of Shiltei HaGiborim. The author of the Sefer, who happened to pass away the same year the Sefer was printed, his name was Rabbi Avraham Portaleone. He was a physician, as we're going to soon see, and his last name was Portaleone, or something like that. More on that name also in the future. Anyway, in this Sefer, we'll talk a lot about this Sefer tonight. In this Sefer, in Perek Lamed Aleph, he has a discussion. In this discussion, he's summarizing a Gemara. And really, there's nothing dramatic about this, except that as we read through the text, a major question is going to surface that I'm going to ask, but it's going to take a minute. First, we have to read through the entire keta over here in Perek Lamed Aleph, and then once we finish this keta, I'm going to ask the question, and this is going to lead into something quite interesting, in my view, and dramatic as well. So he begins his discussion where he picks up where a moment ago he was discussing the placement of the menorah. So let's talk about the placement for a menorah for a second. Here is the Beis Hamikdash, okay, and you come in from Mizrach. You come in from Mizrach, from the east side, and you start moving toward Ma'ariv, and you're eventually going to encounter the menorah. Now, the menorah has 8 branches, so the question is 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, or here it's better, use a fork, because that's actually much better for the menorah. So the simple question is the menorah like this, where the branches are essentially going from north to south, or are the branches like this, where it is going from east to west? The Rambam holds that the menorah was like this, that the branches were going from north to south. That's a chiddush, and he's having a major discussion about that. So he says, because I already got into this, and we were talking about how the shulchan and the menorah was set up in the Beis Hamikdash, so I made up my mind that what I'm going to do is, I'm going to present the whole sugya of Gemara, or 2 of the sugyas of the Gemara, where Chazal spoke about this, in Menachos, Perek Shtei HaLechem, which in Gemara Menachos comes out to Daf Tzadik Ches and Daf Tzadik Tes. In other words, he's telling you, I already got into the Gemara, I'm going to give you the whole thing. But he says, I'm going to give you the whole thing. And he says as follows. And so what I did is, I divided, we're not reading from the Gemara, I'm being intentional about that. I'm reading what he says, it says in the Gemara, and I divided it into 5 sections. So let's do the sections. Number 1, Tanu Rabbanan, section number 1. Asara Shulchana is Asa Shloim. Shlomo, when Shlomo built the first Beis Hamikdash, he didn't just build 1 shulchan, which is what the mitzvah is. He built 10 of them. How do I know? Because there's a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim. Shlomo's Beis Hamikdash is reported twice, once in Sefer Malachim and once in Divrei Hayamim. In Divrei Hayamim it says that he made 10 shulchanos. Vayanach behechol, he put it in the hechol. Chamisha miyamin and chamisha mismail. 5 were on the right-hand side, 5 on the left-hand side. So what happens is, now the Gemara asks, V'im toimar chamisha miyamin ha-pesach v'chamisha mismail ha-pesach. Do you want to say that maybe they were on the right and the left-hand side of the doors? So let's explain. Again, you're coming into the Beis Hamikdash here. So you are on the east, you're walking in, and there's a door here, the door to the Heichal. So is it 5 and 5? No, you can't say it's 5 and 5. Why can't you say it's 5 and 5? Because Matzinu Shulchan B'Daraim, because then it's going to come out that the Shulchan is going to be in the southern side, but the Torah says clearly that the Shulchan's on the northern side. So you can't say 5 on this side, 5 on that side means that the door splits them. Rather, what it means is that a taco is on the northern side. You have the 10 Shulchanos were here. You had the main one from Moshe Rabbeinu was built, and then 5 on one side of Moshe's and 5 on the other side. When it says Shlomo Melech did 5 and 5, it all means on the northern side, but 5 on one side of Moshe Rabbeinu's Shulchan, 5 on the other side. That concludes piece 1 of the Gemara, the way he summarizes it. Then we go to piece 2. Piece 2 discusses the following. We have 10 shulchanos that Shlomo made, says the Gemara, where did they put the lechem? Where did they put the bread? The lechem upon him. There's 10 tables. Only the Tanna Kama says they only put it on the one table that was there from Moshe Rabbeinu. And the raya is, because Pasuk in Malachim, when it discusses the Beis Hamikdash of Shlomo, it says, it says, the shulchan singular, the shulchan in singular had lechem upon him. So here we know, although we had another 10 tables, but this was not, no lechem went on it. However, that's only the Tanna Kama. Rabbi-Doctor, Rabbi Shimon disagrees and says, no, all of the tables had bread. And he brings a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim where it says, Ves ha-shulchanos va'aleim lechem upon him. So here you see it's talking in the plural about the shulchan, and it says they all had lechem upon him. So now Rabbi Yossi supports the Tanna Kama, and he wants to say that it was only on the shulchan of Moshe. So what's he going to do with the plural? So he comes up with a solution. He says, I'll tell you what it was. In addition, when it says the shulchanos in the plural, it's referring to something else. He goes on to explain that in the ulam, so before you come to the heichal, which had the shulchan and the menorah, there was an antechamber that's called the ulam. In the ulam, there were 2 tables. One, he says, was from silver, and one, he says, was of gold. And when they would bring the new bread in, they would put it down on the silver table. And when they would take the old bread out, they would put it onto the gold table. And that's what it talks about in plural. Bread is on tables in the plural. It's not referring to the 10 that Shlomo HaMelech made that were inside the heichal. No. There, only one table had bread. The pasuk that talks about a plural is talking about these other types of shulchanos that were constructed entirely differently, and it was in the ulam, it's the silver and the gold. Again, silver on the way in, gold on the way out. What's pshat? Why do we need to put the bread down when we're schlepping it and schlepping it out? So that on the way out, it's actually easy. What happened was they would take off the bread, and then there was lavoina, the spice that was on that sat on the shulchan. They had to bring that onto the mizbeach. So they couldn't give out the lechem for others to take. You had to wait till that akrav happened. So during that period in time, however long it lasted, it was sitting on the gold tables. What about the silver? Why they have to, when they brought new lechem in, why was it sitting on a silver table? So Rashi says, today's they say is Yortzeit of Rashi, Chof Tes Tammuz. So Rashi says that the reason is Pashut because it was heavy, and you wanted a rest, they needed a break. So they had a halfway point where they would put it down, and that was on a silver table. And then the Gemara says that if you look at this, you'll notice that it's Ma'alim HaKodesh Ve'emeridin. Because where's the first place the bread goes down? It goes on silver. From there, then it goes into the heichal, it goes on gold. And once it goes on a gold, the actual shulchan was gold. When it comes out and it needs to be put on a table while they're bringing the carbon, it also goes on gold. So here you see that Ma'alim HaKodesh, you could go from silver to gold, but Ve'emeridin, you don't go from gold down. This is the second piece of the Gemara that Rabbi Avraham the Roifa and Shulta Gebar and Perek Lamed Aleph brings. Then he brings the third piece of the Gemara. Tanya Rabbi Yossi Yomer. That what happens if a person removed the old bread, the bread was changed on Shabbos. What if you remove the old bread in the morning and you brought the new bread arvis toward the evening? Ein b'kach klum, that's not a problem. It says about the lechem apanim, it needs to be lefanai tamid. It always needs to be there the whole time. It means that it shouldn't go on night. So in other words, if you took it off in the morning and you had 6 hours in between, and the new bread you only brought later in the day on Shabbos, it's fine as long as you didn't have a night in between. This is the sugya, the third part of the Gemara. Then he tells us, Rabbi Avraham Portaleone says, okay, Oidamru, now let me tell you more that it says over there. And he goes and he brings the next part, which we're going to call part number 4. Tanu Rabbanan, we have a brisa. Before we said that Shlomo HaMelech did 10 shulchanos. Now we're learning also the 10 menorahs. 10 menorahs Shlomo made. Again, Divrei Hayamim tells us Vayases menorahs hazav eser. He made 10 of them, and he put it again 5 on the right, 5 on the left, and the Gemara has the same discussion. You're going to say 5 on the right of the door and 5 on the left on the door? No, that you can't say that. Why can't you say that? Because the menorah needs to be on the south. So if the menorah needs to be on the south, you can't have, so it must be that they were all on the south. Narva then, Moshe's menorah was in the middle, and then you had Shlomo's on the 2 sides of the menorah. That's the fourth. And now we come to the final piece of the Gemara that Rabbi Avraham Portaleone brings. And he says, just like with the Shulchan we discussed, which one did you put bread on? Now we're going to discuss which one did you kindle. So he says, Esem Eneides Hasa Shloima, the Lo Yehoyam Adlikin Ella Al Shal Moshe. The Tanakama says they only lit the one from Moshe Rabbeinu, and it brings a raya from a pasuk where you have over here a conversation between two kings. Avia was the king of Malchei Yehuda, and he was talking to Yeravam, who was the king of Malchei Yisrael. And Avia is saying, we have the true religion, you guys mess things up. And when he's discussing about the fact that they remain loyal to Hashem, he talks about the fact that they light a menorah, and he says it in the singular. So it sounds like in the Beis Hamikdash, despite the fact that there were many menorahs, they were only kindling one. And so that's how we know that Lo Yehoyam Adlikin Ela Shal Moshe. This is a Tanakama, but Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, just like he disagreed earlier, and he said no, that it was placed on all of the shulchanos had bread. He disagrees over here and he says, no, kulon hoyum adlikin, and he brings a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim where it talks about menorahs with their light, and it is in the plural. And so therefore, essentially the same achloikas that we had by the shulchan, we end up having by the menorah, and that is the end of the sugya, the way he brings it. Now, before he read this sugya of Gemara, he told us, I'm going to give you the whole thing. And the way he's giving it verbatim. He is giving it verbatim. And so it stands to reason that he's going to try to do a good job in quoting the Gemara. Now, the problem is that he doesn't really do such a good job in the way he presents this sugya. And that's because it's entirely reshuffled in the order of all of these pieces that are here. So basically, if you open a Gemara in Menachos, and you're going to go to Daf Tzadik Ches and Daf Tzadik Tes. What you're going to find is, yes, the sugya begins with the discussion. What we have here as number 1 is there as number 2. But then it goes to what we have here as number 3. And then it goes to what we have here as number 5. And then it goes to what we have here as number 2. And then it goes, the order is 1, 4, 2, 5, 3. So the entire sugya of the Gemara has been reshuffled in the way he presents it over here, and he doesn't tell us that he's reshuffling the order of the Gemara. Number 1. Number 2, the girsa in terms of the rabbis are different. He gives us here Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. If you open to your Gemara, you're not going to find Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. What you're going to find is Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. It's a similar name, but at the end of the day, it's different, and that probably isn't an accident. Also, the other rabbi was Rabbi Yossi. He quotes it as Rabbi Yossi. We don't have Rabbi, in our Gemara it's Rabbi Yossi, but it's more. It's Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. And again, the way he's quoting it verbatim, we'd expect him to give it word for word, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, just like he does everything else. He literally does everything else. And when he skips words, you know what he does? He does v'chulu. We saw that clearly. And so something is definitely going on over here that's really interesting. And as we're going to move along, we're going to clarify this specific thing. Just want to mention over here, he goes on to say that he likes the opinion, not of the Tanakama, that they only lit Moshe's menorah, and that they only put the lechem on Moshe's shulchan. He doesn't like that. Why? So he gives him multiple reasons, but one of the main points is but then what was the purpose of the other menorahs? If you're not going to light them, and you're not going to put bread on the other ones, then it's levatala, so it's for no purpose, when everything in the Beis Hamikdash has to have a purpose. And so therefore, that's one of the reasons he says he prefers the shita that he calls Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, that again, in our Gemara is Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. Okay, now, so that's our driving question for today. I didn't really tell you much about him. Now we want to learn a little bit about this individual, Rabbi Avraham Portaleone. It turns out he's a real fascinating individual, very interesting life, and rather than having to pick up bits and pieces like we often have to do when it comes to great rabbis, here he actually tells us himself. And that's because at the end of the book, at the end of the Sefer that is called Shiltei HaGiborim, at the end of the Sefer he has a long chapter in where he talks about himself. So we're going to read major chunks of this and get to know this individual. Amar Avraham Portaleone of Mantua. So now we know where he's from. He's from Mantua. That's where the Sefer was printed, if I recall correctly. And he's Avraham Portaleone. He's a physician. He says his father's name was David Mishar Aryeh. David Mishar Aryeh. So what does Mishar Aryeh mean? So if you remember, his last name is Portaleone. So Port is a Shar. And Leon, in Latin, is a Aryeh. So what he's doing is he's basically taking his Latin, Italian last name, and he's translating it into Hebrew, calling it Mishar Aryeh. Okay, he says his father was Avir HaRoifim, was a major league physician. He himself was the son of Rabbi Elazar HaRoifa HaMuvak. So 3 generations of physicians, but no, that's not enough because it's 4. Because he was the son of Rabbi Binyamin Parash HaIvri. So a Parash is a knight. So I guess this Rabbi Binyamin, our hero's great-grandfather, was knighted, which did happen from time to time, that there were people who achieved high rank in European society and they were knighted. Okay, this Eltazeda of his was the Roifa of the king of Naples. And he gives here the name of the king of Naples who reigned during the 15th century. And then he says he was also a physician of his relative, the Duke of Milan. And he gives his name here as well. So this guy's great-grandfather was a very prestigious physician in the 1400s on the Italian peninsula. Okay, now he tells us a little bit about himself. He says, the time I was born, it was Chatzos Laila of Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Shin Beis. So if you're keeping score at home, that is 1542. When I was a child, I learned Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, Bediktuk, okay? He tells us a little bit about his teachers over here. He says that he had a teacher named Yehoisef Sinai. He learned Rambam, Mishnah, and Pirushei HaTorah v'Anavim. So that's like, so basically level 1 was Tanakh. Level 2 was Rambam, Mishnah, and biblical commentary. Then he says as follows. In the city of Bologna, Achrei Pardi Mimenu, after I left my teacher Yehoisef, I started learning by another teacher. This teacher's name was Yaakov Afano. And Shimashti Yosef B'Poskim Gemara. He's learning now next level. He's learning Poskim. He's learning Gemara. But then he goes on to say the following: Al ki oz naga banu yad Hashem. But then the hand of God was upon us. V'chemed einenu haya l'sreif hasesh. And that which we very much treasure was put to the flames. So as a result of that, Chazarti Mantua. I went back to Mantua. Okay, he doesn't specify exactly what he means over here when he says Chemed einenu haya l'sreif hasesh, that something was consumed by fire, but we'll get there. As we move along, this will become clear. Acharav shakarti v'nachti al shichmi. I found comfort by taking a new teacher. And he goes on to describe the next teacher that he has. He's a goin, and he has so many honorifics over here. I cut many of them out. He's a makubal, he's a roifa, he's a philosopher, a theologian, philosopha liki. Avraham Portaleone. So that's his next teacher. And he says, where was he living? Where was he giving his light? In Casale Monteferrato. That's where he was teaching. And over there, he filled my belly with basar and yain of Gemara. So he's learning Gemara over there. Because in that place, by God's grace, we had kol chelkei ha-Torah sheba'al peh. In that place, we had all portions of Torah sheba'al peh, and so therefore, that was a good place to be learning. A very, very interesting lashon, where he's talking about that this place had all chelkei Torah sheba'al peh, and we'll come back to that as we move along as well. But here we're going to start realizing that this Rabbi Avraham Portaleone was not just a Talmud Chacham, not just a rabbi. He was also a Renaissance man. And indeed, he's living during the Italian Renaissance. And that leads to the following. He says, I also learned from this Rabbi Avraham Portaleone, he taught me Latin. He taught me Latin. We learned philosophy. And with him, we went to Pavia, Lishmoya Beknesias Haroifim, to go here in essentially in university where physicians are being trained. And that's where we learned the Philosophia Aristotelius. That's where we learned Aristotelian philosophy. And we learned Refuah Hippocrati. That's Hippocrates. So we learned Hippocrates was still, Hippocrates lived during the time of the Beis Hamikdash. But for many centuries here, we're dealing with a Maaseh here in the 1500s. In the 1500s, they were still learning, just like they were still learning Aristotle, they were still learning Hippocrates' medicine. And V'galenu ha-Yavanim. So this is Galen. Galen, the physician Galen, who is known as Galen the Greek, a very famous physician around 2,000 years ago as well. And we studied Arab, the medicine of the Arabs. Nonetheless, I didn't drop learning. I was learning Torah all the time. Why? I have this phenomenal person who was always with me. Okay, now he talks about his graduation. He was received a doctorate in philosophy and medicine. So 3 months after him, I also. So literally this means in the theaters of Pavia. But lest you think that this means that it was a movie theater, no, it's not what it was. A theater just means it was the big room in the university where all the students would come, and there are these very, very public ceremonies and graduations. And he's trying to say that that's where he received his degree, together with the other philosophers and physicians. I think what this means is that there were some Jews, okay, generally speaking in Pavia, there were not a lot of Jewish graduates of the University of Pavia. He's an exception. And one of the big issues is that you had to either officially be a Christian, or at least you had to subscribe to certain Christian beliefs in order to get entry into many of these schools. There was University of Padua, and Padua was in the Republic of Venice. And Venice was a little more tolerant in this area, and so in Padua you had many Jewish students during this period who were, I don't know, mamish during the 1500s, but definitely a few decades later, many Jewish students are in the University of Padua. Pavia is less common. I think so. I think it's less common. But anyway, I think what the point he's trying to say over here is that some of the students, to get a degree, it's like it's unofficial, it's done on the side. It wasn't. He's saying no. When I did it, it was part of the regular system. Okay. Okay, we did that. When did it happen? It was on Chai Nisan. Chai Nisan Shin Chav Vav, 1566. That's when he received his advanced degree. And then later that year, Yutas Elul Gimel, September, in the week of Parshas Nitzavim, that's when he was accepted by Roifei HaKollegio Mantua, the College of Physicians of Mantua. So it's not enough to have a medical degree. Now you have to get into the guild that controls who practices medicine and has a license to practice medicine in Mantua. And he was accepted by the College of Physicians later that year. I had now permission to treat anyone in the area following his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, as we saw before. Quick note, you'll notice that he gave the day the 3rd of September. And I once spoke about this in a prior class when we did Henry VIII and the Italian rabbis. I believe we saw it then, maybe another time also. The Italian rabbanim during this period of time, in the 1500s, 1600s, were very comfortable using secular dates for months, but they avoided using the Christian year. And I think the reason was they just weren't comfortable counting to the Christian founder. But September, October, November, I don't think that bothered them, and you see an expression of that over here as well, where he throws in the 3rd of September, but at no point does he use secular years, or what would then been known as Christian years. Okay, now he continues telling us his life story. Now my father is getting old, he tells us, and I had the merit of taking his place. So taking his place, whatever official office his father had, he has that position right now. He also received training from his father. That's like the, what's it? Yeah, but when you in those days they would have called more like an apprenticeship or something like that, where you actually learn. Hippocrates meant you were learning books. So Sarach Ion, how much that actually helped you in your day-to-day life of being a physician, I'm not sure. But this was the real thing. Someone who actually, you apprentice under someone who was a real physician, and so that's what he did over here. Now he tells us that he also learned by his father, Lichrois Arlas Hanaorim. So in English we call this today a moil. He doesn't use that word here. And he was trained by his father to do that. And from Vav Cheshvan Shnas Shin Chav Vav, 1566, from Parshas Lech Lecha, till Yutas Adar Shin Samachei, which is 1605, Parshas Kisisa, it's a span of 39 years, I gave a bris Malti Shloish Meis Ushishim Yeladim, that is 360 children. That comes out to about 9 a year. Was there competition in Mantua? Was there another mile? Or are we dealing with a very small Jewish community? I'm not sure, but 39 brisim a year don't sound like a terribly a lot. Okay, how does he know exactly how many brisim? So if earlier this year you went to Manhattan and you went to the tour, the JTS exhibition, then you know. Because remember what we saw over there? One of the things was from Italy. A pincus of a mile, remember? And it wasn't from the 1500s, it was a little later. But every bris the person did, he had the information, name, the father's name, the mother's name, who was the sandik. I don't remember all the details that were there. And he goes on, he says, that's why he has that pincus. Because he has a kenida b'sifri amyuchalazeh. And he goes on to describe what exactly all the information he has. So he was able to look back, and he's able to say, I did 360 brisim. Okay, now he goes on to say, because of the tremendous burden of healing fellow Jews, and also the non-Jews, so the high society, and the important people who even live outside of Mantua, I did not study Torah enough. So it's interesting. When he was in college and university, so there he says, I was with, he had his Chabad on campus, was with him over there, because he had this great Rav, Rabbi Avraham Portaleone, and he's like, no, we learned and we were steiging away, everything was good. But here, when it actually we hit the real world in terms of Parnasa and actual real job, here he had a real difficult time learning. And instead of studying, I actually wrote a book in Latin, a self-help book. For, again, the high society, the noblemen, the dukes, they want to know. Everyone wants to know, what's the best way to live. Refuah, v'shailas chuvas latini l'roifim shalom ibnei amenu chutz me'erazais. He also wrote another book. He wrote medical responsa to physicians, non-Jewish physicians, who, I guess he was so good, they would send their questions. It's, before ChatGPT, so they would send the questions to him, and he turned this into a book. And then he goes on to say that the third Duke of Mantua, and he spells him out by name over here, asked him to write a treatise on the healing powers of gold. That is, since antiquity, there was belief that gold, for whatever reason, had healing powers, or gave a person more strength. And so there's a many traditions have this of mixing gold in here and mixing gold in there. I don't know, maybe check your Tylenol, there may be gold in there. But anyway, so this Duke asked him, is it true? And he wrote a treatise, and he says, so it was printed in Venice in the year Shin Mem Dalid, which is 1584. So basically, he's telling you that he was involved in non-Jewish publication, medical publications, and those types of pursuits, and he regrets it. The sin of not studying Torah came back to haunt me. And once, my pile of sins got too high, God put his hand on me in the year 1605, and because of the fact that I disregarded the Torah, I lost the chayis in my limbs. I couldn't walk. And to move my hand and my arm, my left hand. So it looks like this was a stroke. I was like dead on my bed. So it's a long time, from Tammuz 1605 to Nisan 1606. And after davening, and I did tshuva, and I was pleasing with Hashem, I'm like, I need to fix my boo-boo. So how is he going to fix it? So after the last Pesach, meaning Shna Shin Samach Vav 1606, Here Hashem es Ruchi, I received, Hashem awakened within me the mood, the spirits, and I started writing this Sefer. And God gave me the merit lahashlim biyadi hayamanis, to write with my right hand. I have to assume he was anyway right-handed. Hashloisha maginim ha'ela, the three maginim shall Sefer Shiltei Hagiborim. The three maginim. Okay, what is this Sefer? Shiltei Hagiborim has Magen Aleph, Magen Beis, and Magen Gimel. Magen means a shield. What he's doing here, he's writing to his children, and he says it's not only for my children, but anyone who wants to join this program. It's a program. This book is not a book, it's a program. The program is Shachris, this is what you read, this is what you learn. And he spells out what it is. And obviously, if it's Shacharis, it's going to be connected with the Avodah and the Beis Hamikdash on Shacharis. And he gives a whole seder, again, of what you're going to read and what you're going to learn every morning for Shacharis. And then he has same thing for Mincha. And here again, because in the Beis Hamikdash there's an Avodah Mincha time, so it's all of the material there, or at least most of the material there, is connected to the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash that was done Bein Arbayim toward the end of the day. And then he has Magen Gimel. What's Magen Gimel? Magen Gimel it's basically a learning program of what you should learn the entire year. So it's like on the first day of Parshas Bereishis, in Chumash you learn this, in Navi you learn this, in Ksuvim you learn this, in Gemara you learn this, in Medrash you learn this, in Mishnah you learn this, in Zohar you learn this. And he has like literally the Mara Makomis of where you start and where you stop. It's a Moira Shir. It takes you through the entire year. And he's creating this Sefer. Why? This is the tikkun, in order to stress the importance of learning Torah and having shiurim, kvuim, where a person learns every single day. He's like, I didn't do it, so I want others. I don't want my mistake repeated, definitely not with my children, and that's the core of the Sefer. Except that he wrote an introduction. And the introduction was, well, if you're going to be learning and reading things about the Avodah and the Beis Hamikdash, then let's actually give background. And that leads to what's not the core of the Sefer, theoretically, and that is 90 chapters. 90 chapters of encyclopedic level of comprehensiveness, going through all aspects of the Beis Hamikdash. He also is an expert at going off on huge tangents, and you already see he's interested in not only in Torah, he's also interested in secular knowledge. And this secular knowledge is very much integrated into this book. So for example, if he's going to talk about the Ketores, he wants to know each one of the Ketores, what exactly it is, and he brings this opinion and that opinion, and then he brings his scientific knowledge to bear into the discussion. And same thing with music, the Shir of the Levian. He discusses music and how music works and what the instruments were and then he'll go off on tangents and he'll talk about instruments in general and music in general. And if you think about it really, if you want to talk about the natural world, the Beis Hamikdash is a great place, is a great platform to do that, because there's clothing in the Beis Hamikdash, there's doimim, there's gold, there's silver, there's construction, there's music, there's instruments, there's karbanis mincha, there's vegetation, there's animals. So like you could literally talk about anything, and he does that. And he does that in the Sefer. We're not going to see so much of that today because of the angle that we're going with. But so it's interesting because this is in the 90 chapters, but the 90 chapters is Akdama. But this is ultimately what happens is that he's the first person to have written a Sefer on the Beis Hamikdash. Because till him, anyone who wrote anything about the Beis Hamikdash, take the Rambam for example. The Rambam wrote a lot on the Beis Hamikdash. But it's on his commentary to Mishnayos Midos, so it's there, which is the Beis Hamikdash, or it's an Ochos Beis Abchira. Fine, great. So it's part of the larger work. But here I'm writing a book on the Beis Hamikdash, and others did it after. And I believe he's the first one to have written a Sefer that's a Sefer on the Beis Hamikdash. This is a Sefer Shiltei HaGiborim. Okay, so now we know a little more about the Sefer. But let me remind you that we asked the question in the beginning. And the question in the beginning is, why is he quoting a Gemara? And he seems to be getting the quote wrong. So we're going to actually, instead of answering that question now, we're going to actually build up that question. And I want to look at three specific pieces of his, and that's really going to be the shir, and then we'll come to the answer. So the three specific pieces of his are where he's going to be talking about an aspect in the Beis Hamikdash. He's going to say interesting things about his access to the Gemara. That's what we're going to see in all three of these pieces. So let's go number one. The Rambam in Ilchos Matame Mishkov U'Moshav Perak Yud Aleph says the following: B'Motzei Yom Tov, after Yom Tov, Hayu Matbilim in the Beis Hamikdash, Kol HaKelim Shayu B'Mikdash. They would immerse, they would put into the mikveh all of the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Mipnei Shanogu Ben Amei Haaretz Beregel B'Shas Achad. Because you have Amei Haaretz who come to the Beis Hamikdash and they're not tahar, and they came in anyway. Maybe they shouldn't have been there, but they came and they were there and they touched things. So you have to just, all of the kelim Beis Hamikdash, everything needs to go into the mikveh, and we do that after the Yom Tovim. Because of this reason, they said to them, Rambam doesn't spell out who said to whom. So, but they said to them, Al tigu b'shulchan, don't touch the shulchan. When we show it to the Jews who came to the Beis Hamikdash, the Gemara says in Chagiga, if I recall correctly. Yeah, it's a Gemara in Chagiga, that it says that on the Yom Tif, they would show the shulchan, and they would show the bread, and they would show the miracle of how, though it's late in the week, it's still fresh and it's still warm. And it said, this is Hashem's sign of love to you, the Jewish people. So the Rambam is referencing that apparently, and he says that when they're doing that, you have to be really careful that no one should touch it. We're not going to want it to become tameh, and then we're going to have to go through this immersion after Yom Tif. What's the problem? Just take the whole shulchan and put it into the mikvah. The nimsa tzarech tefillah b'harav shemesh is going to need to be immersed. It's going to have to go in the mikvah, and then it's going to have to wait for evening to become tar, and that's a problem because lechem aponim needs to be lefanai tamid. Needs to be there the whole time. Now I know we learned before that a few hours in the middle of the day is okay, but here you need to wait till harav shemesh. You're waiting for harav shemesh. Now it's already evening time, and so we want to make sure the shulchan doesn't get tameh, and so we can't tovel it. And so here we tell people, don't touch it, don't touch it. We don't want it to become tameh. Okay. So now what Avraham the Roifeh does is he tells us there are people, he calls them bacharim, who make a mistake about this passage of Rambam. This is the false logic that they do. They say, Rambam talks about showing the shulchan, but Rambam doesn't say that they brought the shulchan out of the heichal. The shulchan sits in the heichal. At no point did the Rambam say they brought the shulchan out. So if they didn't bring the shulchan out, so then that means it remained in the heichal and the Jews are seeing it. Now, how are the Jews seeing it, right? So they assume that, well, maybe the pshat just means that everyone's invited into the heichal on Yom Tov. Everyone's invited into the heichal. And in fact, another part of the diuk was that when they said don't touch it, it didn't say koyanim don't touch it. It said generally don't touch it. So it sounds like it's talking to everyone. It sounds like it's talking to Amei Aratzim. And so you had bacharim, we don't know who these bacharim were, who made a diuk. And the diuk is a major chiddush. And the chiddush is that although normally we say that, there's the Azara, and in the Azara there's only this place where you're allowed to go, and then, as we'll see in a second, there's a place that if you really need, you could go because you're doing tenufa, you need to raise your thing, or you're doing smicha, you need to lean on the animal, or if a Yisrael is doing shchita, so then he's allowed to get into what's called the Ezra's Koyanim. But in the Heichel, Yisrael will never end up in the Heichel or anything like that. Well, these Bachran came up with a chiddush. They said, based on this Rambam, it basically comes out that Yom Tov, all bets are off. All rules are off. Hashem loves us so much on Yom Tov. Everyone's invited into the Heichel, and therefore they tell them, hey, don't touch the Shulchan. Well, Rabbi Avraham Portaleone got very nervous about this. And he says, Rabbi Mibnei Ameinu. This is in Perek Chav Tes. Many people, based on this Rambam, make a mistake. And now, he does something very interesting in a parenthesis. He's like, okay, but the mistake is based on the Rambam. So how did the Rambam allow such a mistake to be made on his text? So you know what he says? He says, because the Rambam was relying on someone who's going to read it in the Gemara. But these guys aren't reading it in the Gemara. Now this is really interesting. Two things. Number one, they're not reading the Gemara. Why are they not reading the Gemara? But hold that thought for later. The other point is, he says the Rambam relied that people are going to be reading in the Gemara. The Rambam in Hakdama says, I want my Sefer to be that you read Torah Shabbat and my Sefer, and you don't need the Gemara. All right, but the truth is, this itself is complicated because there's a long string of rabbis who said, well, it can't be the Rambam really meant that because of this or that or the other. So we can add this into the list. Here you have a rabbi basically saying that no, when the Rambam said what he said, when the Rambam wrote, he assumed you have knowledge of the Gemara. Okay. Now what's their mistake? Ha'aminu, they say, Shakol, Shiftei B'nai Yisrael, everyone can go into the Heichel because that's God loves the people. Even though that a whole year they can't, and they have to stand far from the Ezes Koinim, except Mishat Sarchem, L'smicha, L'shchita, L'tnufa. Those are the three things. The Rambam brings Hilchas Beis Abchira. A Yisrael is allowed to go into the area of the Azar that's closer to the Mizbeach, that's known as Ezes Koinim. First, smicha, leaning on the animal, the shchita, if the zar is going to do shchita, or trufa, there's no choice. You need to do it at the right pace of the Beis Hamikdash. But other than that, Yisrael has no business being there. And he's like, this really disturbs me. It's got to be wrong. It just doesn't make sense that Yidden, Yisraelim are allowed to run and to storm the Heichel. No. V'loi nachti, I didn't rest. Acha shamati, mashachosh ganashi, lohoisi midaiton shibish galot hazeh. I needed to hear something to disabuse them of this mistake. Who signain mashakasu rabbis hinus have mesechas haniskeres, and what's going to help? The language of the rabbis in the said mesechta in Meseches Chagiga. Okay, So, okay, so quote us the Gemara. So he says, Shenimsa Kosov al Nior v'diftera metushtashas. We found this Masechta written out on paper, on parchment, and it's worn out. Begins a goyin echem in Verona. One rabbi in Verona in Italy has access to the Gemara. And how do I access? I'm not in Verona, so how do I have access to this Gemara? Shakaru ba'ozni al regal echad bachar echad sham lebetera. While I was on one foot, a bacher who learned Torah told me that what the Gemara says, and this bacher passed away already. So basically, he's saying that you know what's going to get rid of the myth? The Gemara. And how did I get the Gemara? Because in Verona, there's Epis Ksav Yad, and I heard it from a bacher for the. What did he hear? And he writes over there. He writes a summary of what the Gemara says. He writes a summary of what Rashi says. And he writes a summary of what Tosfos says. And then from Tosfos, it's the clearest. Let's see Tosfos and Chagiga Daf Chavava Mid Beis, which Rabbi Avraham quotes. The Gemara says, like the Rambam said, we said on Yom Tov, don't touch the table. Lo tigu b'shulchan. Who are we talking to? Says Tosfos, B'koyanim Amei Haaretz. We're talking here to the Koyanim who were Amei Haaretz, and they were going to the Heichol Ishtachavos. They had permission to go into the Heichol to bow, so they could touch the Shulchan. So we're warning them, don't touch the Shulchan. De'ilu Yisrael, if someone's a non-Koyan, Lo Yoyeruyin Leilech Haf Bein Ulam Mizbeach. Between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, they can't even go. And V'chein Pirush Rashi. Rashi also says the same thing. So he brings this. And his main point is, look from Tosfos, it's clear from Tosfos and Rashi that it's talking about Koyanim. They're the ones that had access to touch it. It's interesting because Tosfos doesn't connect this at all to the showing of the bread. He says, no, it's nothing to do with showing anything. It simply has to do with the many Koyanim. But I think because the people who were appointed to show, they were appointed, so they were good. They were chaverim, they were non-tameh, so that wouldn't have been an issue. The koyanim that would have held it from afar for the people to see, that wouldn't have been a problem. But so who are we telling? We're telling random koyanim. Yom Tov people come. Some of them are not trustworthy, but Yisrael, no, Yisrael's not there. So Avraham Portaleone, good, we busted this myth. I figured out what Tosfos had, and he writes this into his Sefer, so people should stop making this mistake. And obviously the real interesting piece over here is no one knows the Gemara, and the Gemara is one manuscript in Verona that he heard al regal echad. That's scene one. Scene two is a discussion about the Lishkas Hagazis. We're going to read now from the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos Maseches Midos, where the Rambam discusses the Lishkas Hagazis with the Sanhedrin. This is the chamber where the Sanhedrin would preside over cases. Says the Rambam like this: V'chein is bar b'Gemara Yuma. It says in Gemara Yuma, Shalishkas Hagazis Chesed Kodesh Chesed Chol. The Gemara says in Maseches Yuma that this chamber actually was not one status of sanctity. It had two statuses. One status was Kodesh, means Kedushas HaAzara. It had the same level of Kedusha as the Azara. The Chesed Chol. Chol here is not Mamish Chol, because anything on Har Bayis is already a Madreg of Kedusha. But the point is, relative to Kedushas HaZara, there's another part that's a lower level, whether it's the level of the Chel or the level of Har Bayis. I don't know exactly which bucket it would go into, but it's a lower level of Kedusha. Continues the Rambam and says about this Lishkas Hagazis that it had two doors. One was open to the Kodesh, which means Azara, was open to the place that was Kodesh. Ve'echad pasuach l'chol. And that explains the two halves. One is Chol, one is Kodesh, based on where the entrances are. Now the Rambam says the shocking statement. The shocking statement is, the part that was non-Kodesh is Ma'ariv. So let's think this through again. You're coming into the Beis Hamikdash from Mizrach. You're going toward Ma'ariv, which means the higher Kedusha is toward the west. The Lishkas Hagazis is over here on the north side of the Beis Hamikdash. And what Rambam is telling us is Kodesh and Chol, right? The Ma'ariv side, which means closer to the Heichol, closer to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that's Chol. And the Mizrach side, which means closer to the way you came in, that's Kodesh. That's very counterintuitive. This line is very counterintuitive. And in fact, in Hilchos Beis Habchira, when the Rambam discusses Perek Zayin, that line's not there. He says it's half and half, and he says it had two doors, but he does not say that it was the western side that was Kodesh. And when you read it, therefore, most people assume the other way around. The eastern side, which is further away from the holy areas, would be the one that is Kodesh. Continues the Rambam, says, and that half, the western half, which is Chol, there you're allowed to sit, a person is allowed to sit because other than that, we don't sit in the Azara. Only Malchus Beis David, Malchi Beis David are allowed to sit in the Azara. No one else is allowed to sit in the Azara. But we know there's a Sanhedrin over there. Sanhedrin we're sitting. Yeah, because it was in the part of this room that wasn't Kodesh. This is the Rambam.
Why can't we sit in like halfway behind?
There are solutions to this problem. I'll talk maybe more about it in a second. Comes about Avraham Portaleone and Shulte Agabarim Perachov Gimel, and he tells us about a colleague of his, a colleague around the same age, Reb Shmuel Marley, and you know what he did? He fixed the text. He said when the Rambam said Ma'ariv, he really meant Mizrach. You have to change it because it simply doesn't make sense to say that there's more Kedusha on a more western side. It's got to be, more Chayil on a more western side. That doesn't make sense. Then he says, however, after I finished writing out this chapter, which included his own theories about this issue, Hikra Hashem Alekeinu Lefanai, God allowed me to have an encounter with Mitoshvei Tzvat, someone from Tzvas. What's someone from Tzvas doing in Italy? He's going around and he's raising money. To feed his family. They don't have anything. And so he's going around and he's raising money. And what does he do? He starts talking and learning with him. I started hearing the sugya of the second parak of Yoma about Mishtei Lishkas Hagazis. And I'm going to write it here. And you should know that when it comes out from there is that the Rambam, when he said that the western edge of the Lishkas Hagazis was Choil, he's 100% right. Because he has a Gemara backing him up. And then the Goyin of Marley, this Reb Shmuel of Marley, found out what this Tzfati said. And what did he do? He said, okay, let's go back. Let's not, don't change the Girsa. Don't change the Girsa. Leave the Rambam as saying Ma'ariv and don't change it to Mizrach. What's the Gemara? The Gemara, look at the Gemara. Gemara Yuma Daf Chafei Amar Aleph, where it says, Lishkas Hagazis, Payis b'Mizracha, the Kohanim, they would do a goyrel every day about who's going to do which avodah. That happened on the eastern side of the Lishkas Hagazis. The Zaken Yoshev, and where was the Zaken, who Rashi tells us this is a member of the Sanhedrin who's overseeing the goyrel? He would sit down on the western side. Amar Abaya. Abaya says, from here we derive that Lishkas Hagazis was half Kodesh and half Choil. Why? Because if you're going to say it's all Kodesh, then how could the man or the Sanhedrin be sitting on the western side? We know that you're not allowed to sit in the Azara, so it must mean that there was an area there that was Choil. And if you're going to say maybe the whole thing was Choil, no, that can't be either. Because the Goyrel had to be in Kodesh. Why the Goyrel had to be in Kodesh? Because we have a pasuk in Tehillim Beis Alikim Nahalach Berogesh, which Rashi tells us this means we're going to be in Hashem's house Berogesh Beroiv Am. In other words, we want to see action in the Azara. We don't want it to be a quiet place. We want to see action. So if you're going to have the pious, you're going to have this Goyrel, it shouldn't be off in a chamber. It has to be in the Azara. So if you tell me that the Lishkas Hagazis has the din of the Azara, then good. Then it's Beis Alikim Nahalach Berogesh. And so therefore, that's how we know it was half and half. It's very clear in this Gemara. It's half and half, absolutely. It's also very clear in this Gemara. Where was the man sitting? In the western side. Western side is closer to the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So when the Rambam said it was the western side, it was a Befeidish Gemara. Now, so how do you deal with this problem? Okay, so he has a solution with it. I actually don't want to get into it. It's a very famous problem, and it's discussed Shittas HaRambam and other Shittas about how to deal with the fact that you have a door on the western side, more facing the Azara, and then yet that side somehow is less Kodesh. It's a pelataka, and this is discussed. But anyway, what do I want you to see from here? What I want you to see from here is that they didn't have the Gemara. They had to wait for someone to come from Tzvas to tell them, oh, it's a Befeidish Gemara about the Ma'ariv side and whatever. Where did they get that from? They got it from him. And then, all of a sudden, he didn't change the Girsa. He was ready to change the Girsa. Oh, Befeidish Gemara, and then he's not changing the Girsa. So this definitely matches up, and I think slowly we're building a narrative over here, and that narrative is becoming clearer and clearer in our heads. But before we specify and clarify everything, let's do one more. And the last one that we're going to do relates to the Paroiches that divided the Kodesh from the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And if you look at number 9, we'll see how in Shilta Gebar and Perek Yudalid, he brings from Shehetik HaShimoini. Who's Hetek HaShimoini? So Shimoini is a Yalkut Shimoini. Yalkut Shimoini is a Medrash. Presumably it was put together by an individual named Shimon. And he calls it Shimoni. And in Parshas Truma and Siman Shin Samach Zayin. And where is Yalkut Shimoni getting it from? He's getting it from Maseches Yoma. And he says over there the following. Then in the first Beis Hamikdash, there was a wall dividing the Kiddush and the Kiddush HaKadoshim, but Binyan HaAchron in the second Beis Hamikdash did not have a wall. Rather, what it had was there were two rods, Shnei Pasin, and each one of these was an amma and a half long, and you had curtains, paroiches of gold that were hanging on these rods. Okay, so two notes about this. He's quoting Gemara Yuma via what? Via Yalkut Shemaini. He doesn't say the Gemara Yuma. He says Yalkut Shemaini brings a Gemara in Yuma, which is definitely an odd way of quoting the Gemara. The other thing is, actually, it was kind of a guess, and he wasn't right, because it's actually not a Gemara in Yuma. It's a brisa. It's interesting. There's a brisa called Brisa Meleches HaMishkan that goes through many inyanim in the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash, and it's not in Maseches Yuma, and that's where the quote that he has is from. It's from that brisa. But he didn't have, presumably, he didn't have Maseches Yoma with him, and so therefore he didn't know and he couldn't check. Okay, now what does he want to do with this? What he wants to do with this is the following. He got very concerned about the amma and a half. Because if you say something by length is amma and a half, you could easily understand that to mean that there's the heichal, and then you have a rod, an amma and a half, a rod, an amma and a half, so you have a curtain that's an amma and a half, and basically you can see right through into the Kodesh HaKadoshim because it's only an amma and a half. He's like, no. It went the entire breadth. It's 20 ammas. That the opening over there between the Kodesh, the area of the Kodesh HaKadoshim is 20 amas, and the Heichal as well is 20 amas. It's 20. The real length of these rods were actually 20 amas. And when it's said an amma and a half, it actually doesn't really mean the length. It actually means the width, right? If length means the longer of the two sizes, so it was actually 20 amas by an amma and a half. And then he gets into a technical discussion why it calls the width of an amma and a half, why he calls it length, which we don't need to get into. But that's what he's trying to say over here, because he wants to make sure that you recognize that the curtains ran the entire span of the 20 ammas, not just an amma and a half. Okay. Then he says, caveat. What's the caveat? I can't hide from telling you, anything that I wrote about these rods, I'm just telling you what I think. It's based on my own estimation. Why? Why am I relying on my own estimation? So he says two reasons. Number one, the Mefarshim are silent. They don't say anything. So I have to make something up. The second reason, because of the well-known obstacle. There's a well-known obstacle that doesn't allow me to know what the text says. Therefore, I don't know what the Gemara said, because of the Meniya HaYadua. And if it so happens in Yirtzeh Hashem, if God is going to allow in His kindness that we should be able to have the milk and honey, which means Torah, not only we should have Torah, but it should be with the permission of the government, then, and read what it says. And if they say something different than what I told you, follow them, because I didn't intend to argue with them. I just don't know what they say. Okay. All right, so what's the Maisa? What's going on over here? So this is actually something that we spoke about over the years. We spoke about this several times. Several times this issue came up. But today we're going to present it through the account of Rabbi Yehuda Lirma, who wrote a Sefer Lechem Yehuda. It's a commentary on Maseches Avos that was printed in 1554 in Venice. And he writes as follows in the Akdam. He writes about what led him to write the work. And then he says, I found that people really like my work on Maseches Avos. So I decided I'm going to publish it. I'm going to print it. So that people could have it. I already printed. This is the second printing. I already did the first printing in Venice. However, then there was a problem. In the beginning of the year of Heimar Shakaili, and when he wants you to look at one word here. This is a pasuk. This is Naomi saying. Naomi says, she lost all of her family. If she comes back to Eretz Yisrael, she says, God made it bitter for me. Heimar, God made it bitter for me. So in the year of God making it bitter for us, but it's also He's giving us the year. The year is Shin Dalid Yud. Shin Dalid Yud from the year 5000. If you add 5000 plus 314, that gets you to the year of 1553, Rosh Hashanah 1553, which in January switched over to 1554. So, and he's calling it a bitter year. what happened, and it was, he says, in the beginning of the year. And we know from elsewhere that this actually happened on Rosh Hashanah. Gazra Malchus Roimi, the Pope made a decree, B'chol Malchus Edom, in all Christian lands, the Sarfu Talmud, the Gemara was burnt, V'ha'agodos Talmud, and also the Ein Yaakov, Shal Rav Yaakov ben Chabib Zal, was also put to the flames. U'v'chedesh Mar Cheshvan, and in the month of Cheshvan, Kishmoy Kenu, it's a bitter month, Mar Cheshvan, like its name. Gazru b'Venezia, this carried over to Venice. So Venice was not a papal state. So all the papal states, they had to follow what the Pope was saying, and they had to confiscate the Gemaras. Venice is a chiddush already, because Venice was officially independent, a Republic of Venice, but at the end of the day, they couldn't defy the Pope in this way. And so Gazru b'Venezia v'Sarfu Talmud v'Agodos Hanisgaros, and they sent to the flames the same works. V'Gamar Rav Alfasi, even the Rif, and Mishnayos. And when did this happen? It happened on Shabbos Kodesh. And V'Soicham, now relevant to him, Sarfu Kol Sifrei Sheit Fasti, they burnt my entire run. Shayu Elef V'Taf Kuf Svar, 1,500 books. In other words, they came into the printer shop and they saw all the books and they took all these books and they consigned them to the flames. I lost everything in Venice. I don't have anything left from the print. Apparently he sent his manuscript there. That was also taken away and burnt. So now I didn't even have one page. Listen to this. I had to rewrite the whole book. He now needs to sit down and he has to rewrite the whole book. By the way, just interesting. It's an interesting question. When in printing history, when they would print, how many volumes? People have asked me that question. Well, here you see. I don't know if this is an example for others, but here was 1,500. 1,500 Sfarim was what he was printing in those years. Okay, then he says, after I did 3 chapters, I found 1 volume. Someone pulled it out of the fire. The Kanisi Karma had to buy it at an exorbitant rate. And I saw God actually blessed me. What I started writing, the second version, was better than the first one. There's a lot of good stuff. And so he basically, what he did is, he rewrote copying, but whatever he rewrote, so there's like the Madura Basra for the beginning, for the first 3 chapters. And then the rest is presumably what he had there, and that's why it was printed in 1554. It was within a year or so of when the Sfarim were burnt, he already had the Sefer printed. And obviously, if he had to rewrite the whole thing, that would have taken longer than a year. So this is a first-hand account of someone who witnessed, and or didn't witness it, but who definitely was part of the story of the burning of the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah of the year 1553. There's a whole context here. There's a reformation in Europe, and there's a schism, and the Catholic Church sees Martin Luther and Lutheranism and Protestantism and all these people kind of breaking away, and so then that leads to what's called the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation is the doubling down, and like we need to fight them, and we need to fight the Reformation, and so we can't allow Martin Luther's books to be read over here, so they need to be banned. Oh, we're banning books, so we're banning Jewish books as well. And so we spoke about this on a number of occasions and different subjects. It has come up. In fact, relatively recently, when we spoke about the censorship of the Rambam, how the 1574 print, the Kesef Mishnah print of the Rambam, was severely censored. That's a result of this. That's a result of this story, and that we did that a few months ago. Okay, and now we could kind of put all the pieces together of what the Avraham Portaleone is telling us. Number 1, he doesn't have a Gemara. So when he wanted to give us in the beginning the sugya of the 10 tables and the 10 menorahs, he's not telling us that he doesn't have a Gemara. But where's he taking it from? He's saying from Yalkut Shimoni. And if you look at the Yalkut Shimoni in Parshas Truma, he gives it verbatim of the way it's in the Yalkut Shimoni. It's just the Yalkut Shimoni reordered material for his own purposes, and he doesn't know that. So he's just giving it to you exactly the way it was in the Yalkut Shimoni, including the Girsa, not Rabbi Lazar Bereb Shimon or Rabbi Lazar ben Shemua. It's a result of he's taking straight out of the Yalkut Shimoni. And then if you remember, he's like, I was in Bologna and we were learning, and then Chemed einenu haya le'esh, or something like that. Chemed einenu haya l'sreifas esh. So that's a reference to that it happened when he was a bacher learning in yeshiva. He was one of the students who was impacted by this. And then he said that he went to Casel Monferrato, and he learned over there, and they had Gemara. So that's very Mila Kreisi Mi Basar V'Yayna Gemara Kvi. There were some Gemaras. It's not like there were no Gemaras. That rabbi had Gemara. That's why he said in that place we had Kol Chelkei HaTorah Shebal Peh. And it's the same. It's interesting because it's Mantua. It's the same place. Mantua, he says there's no Gemaras, but there was, even though it's the same government, it's under the same duke or whatever it was. But it just that's the way it works. So there was Gemara over there, and he had that. Now in Verona there was one Ksav Yad. Now I think we can figure out what was this Ksav Yad, because he's like there was that Ksav Yad and it was mitushtush. So we may say, oh, it was probably some old manuscript from the 1200s of the Gemara. I don't think so. Why? Because when he summarizes what the Ksav Yad had, he gives you Gemara, Rashi, Tosas. The ancient Kisvei Yad almost never had Gemara, Rashi, Tosas. And the few Kisvei Yad that do have Gemara, Rashi, Tosas is from after the era of print. Never then, someone didn't have access to a printed Sefer, so they wrote out in manuscript Gemara, Rashi, and Tosas. But I don't know that you had a Gemara, Rashi, Tosas in one manuscript in the manuscript age. It simply didn't exist. So this is probably someone knew someone else had a Masechta, and he wrote out the Masechta by hand, and it was Gemara, Rashi, Tosas, and that was in Verona. And yes, an old man had it, and yes, it's being quoted to him. And yeah, they don't know the sugyas. They don't know the sugyas of the Gemara other than through these intermediaries. By the way, another one of the intermediaries is the Rif. So I know that they said in Venice they burnt the Rif, but it was very inconsistent. And in other places the Rif existed, and that was a way of getting access to sugyas of Gemara. We did a class once on gambling, Yehuda Arya of Medina, and we were able to prove the way he quotes the Gemaras, he doesn't have the Gemaras. He has the Rif, and it's from the same thing. And finally, the last piece we saw. He told you befedish, he's quoting from Yalkut Shemaini. So I don't know why he does it. He's like, Yalkut Shemaini says that the Gemara says, okay, and he assumed it's coming from the Gemara. So there he told us befedish, it's coming from the Yalkut Shemaini, and he called it there Miniya Hayadua. He's vague. Miniya Hayadua, why we don't have the Gemara. So if you one day get the Gemara, well, befrat if it's legal. In other words, there's two separate wishes here. One wish is there should be more bootleg copies of the Gemara. That was one wish. The second is it should be legal and we shouldn't have these problems. And eventually that happened. It took a long time. We spoke once about the Basel Gemara in the 1580s. That was a highly censored Gemara. That was also a result of this. You can only have a Gemara that's highly censored, which leads into that whole conversation and discussion over there. Anyway, so that's a little bit about our hero, Reb Avraham the Roif. And I want to conclude with the following quote. He brought for us a quote from the Gemara where Rabbi Yossi said you don't have to have the bread the whole day. As long as it's there in the morning and the evening, then you're good. Right after that, he doesn't have this. He probably didn't have this Gemara. So, and it's not in the Yalkut Shemaini. Right after it's in the Gemara, Rav Ami says that from these words of Rabbi Yossi we derive that if a person learns once in the morning and once in the evening, they're doing the mitzvah of Lo Yamush Sefer Torah Zamipicha. What do you mean? The mitzvah has to be there a whole day. Lo yamush mipicha. Yeah, but with the table, it said tamid. The morning and the night was okay. So too, when it comes to learning Torah, the morning and the night is okay. This is what his Sefer is really about. He doesn't quote this, but again, his Sefer is about giving a recipe for his children and other Jews to learn in the morning and to learn in the evening. So it's really interesting how, although he didn't write about this, the whole book's about the Beis Hamikdash. In the Beis Hamikdash, we already have this lesson about the value of Parak Echad Shachris, Parak Echad Arvis. But if you take a step back here, just from a more historical perspective, this is the first Sefer, as I said before, written on the Beis Hamikdash. And as I said in the title, this is the first Sefer written on the Beis Hamikdash with the rabbi's hands tied behind his back. And it's literally his hands are tied behind his back. He doesn't have access to the Gemaras. But that's not a reason for him not to do it. You find it, if it was really important, you figure it out. And he wrote a whole Sefer. He tells us what the challenges were, and he tried to work it out. And I think if he were sitting here today, he would probably tell us, really, you have so much access to Gemara, what are you guys doing about it? What are you guys doing about access? At least Parak Echad Shachris and Parak Echad Arvis.